Laura Brophy is the director of the Estuary Technical Group at the Institute of Applied Ecology in Corvallis. And she's been doing her work for quite a while. I've known her for about 10 years. We were trying to figure that out. And she has really been working on providing decision support for estuary research and restoration up and down the coast. And in that process, she's built a lot of collaborations with folks that are really moving the development of tools and processes forward to support that estuary restoration. And so that is what she's going to speak with us today about. She's also going to come back and do a Science on Tap in a couple of months, and so watch for that if you're interested in learning a little bit more about her work. But I'll hand it off to Laura. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cinnamon. It's really great to see such a full room. Wow, thank you all. And those who are attending remotely, I really appreciate your being here too. And please do ask questions remotely, and I understand your professor will pass them along to me. So my co-authors on this study that I'll be talking about today are a pretty amazing dynamic group coordinated by the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership. And I'll tell you a little more about that organization in a minute. I won't read all these names, but this has been a fantastic and collegial bunch to work with. My organization, the Institute for Applied Ecology, it's a little nonprofit in Corvallis, so 25, 30 people depending on the season. And we aim to conserve and restore species and habitats and to do the research to support that and to spread the word through education. And the Estuary Technical Group is a subgroup within IAE, and we do those things for estuaries. Our work tends to focus on, like Cinnamon was saying, on decision support tools, some sort of practical tools people could use to help do better restoration and conservation of estuarine resources. So I want to just start with the end. So these are the figures for percent loss of tidal wetlands on the west coast of the US. These are the products of this study that we just did. And it's some pretty striking and shocking numbers, really. So I'm going to sort of take you through our journey of how we developed these numbers, because these are numbers I've been seeking for many years, and it's been really satisfying to get a big handle on this big picture. There are sort of 4 messages that I want to make sure I cover today, and I guess I'm showing you this so that in case I run out of time and don't get to some slides, you'll still have all the important information. We really needed better maps of estuary habitats in Oregon and across the west coast. It was obvious over the last 10 years how badly we needed these. And we've now built them, and I'll be sharing them with you. They are elevation-based maps. It seems obvious when you're working in tidal wetlands that that would be the way to go, but it wasn't the way that they were done in the past. So we made that flip to the more modern approach. And using these new elevation-based maps, we have mapped tidal wetland losses, and I'll tell you how we did it. These are generally high, as you just saw in the last slide, a total loss of 85% of tidal wetlands on the west coast. Super, super high losses, actually. They do vary from estuary to estuary, and I'll show you some numbers on that, too. And then all of these new maps are available online. You can download them and use them and play with them and make whatever kinds of analyses you would like to conduct. And the links are there, and I'll share those several more times. So in order to map a resource, of course, you better define it really carefully in a way that allows you to map it. And so this sort of is the starting point for defining tidal wetlands, and it's pretty obvious, wetlands that are inundated by the tides. But we have to make that concrete in a way that allows us to map the resource. So the first way to think about it is, well, what do they look like in the field? And you're all familiar with mud flats and sand flats. Those are some of the lower tidal wetlands within tide range. These are some of the higher ones, but still low for the low intertidal at the top, seagrasses and algae beds. And then getting into a little higher in the tide range, we see what we call low marsh and high marsh, and also tidal swamp. And by the way, tidal swamp isn't necessarily any higher than these others, but it's fresher. So the tidal swamp is the forested, or, oh, that's right, the pointer doesn't work here. It's the forested or shrub dominated. And I want to show you a couple more pictures of tidal swamps because they are really interesting. They're a special interest of mine. On the left, you can see a shrub tidal swamp, mostly willows in this case. Often that's true. And then a forested tidal swamp on the right. Sitka spruce is usually the dominant on the outer coast for these forested tidal wetlands. A few more pictures of these spruce tidal swamps. They were They were very prevalent on our coast, and I'll mention that a little later in a little more detail. If you're interested in tidal swamps, please do keep an eye out for the Science on Tap presentation, because I'll go into much more detail about these habitats then. So historically, 58% of our tidal wetland area on the Oregon coast consisted of tidal swamp, either shrub or forested, and by far most of it was forested. 54% was forested. 95% of those are gone now. So A, they were a lot more prevalent than we knew before, and B, they were much more impacted than any other tidal wetland type. And I'm only bringing this slide up once, and then I'll stop talking about tidal swamps and their losses, because that's the Science on Tap talk, and I don't want to give it ahead of time. This is that citation at the bottom is the report I'm just finishing up now, and the cover page of it and the summary are over here in case you could grab a copy. If not, that's easily going to be available online shortly. So I probably do not need to talk about why we care about tidal wetlands. If you're here, you probably already know this. By the way, you'll be seeing this picture now and then. David Pitkin took this gorgeous photo of Pool Slough, and it is one of the loveliest pictures of tidal wetlands I've ever seen. So ecological functions of tidal wetlands, there's a lot of them. They help moderate perturbations. They support wildlife and fish, obviously. They can store a lot of carbon. They support water quality. These are some of the creatures that live in and are supported by tidal wetlands, but honestly, anything in the near shore or in the estuary in the bay is going to receive food web inputs and support from tidal wetlands. So having very briefly covered tidal wetland functions, let's move on to the mapping. So the context for this project, I mentioned before, the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership supported this work. And I'm super grateful to this organization, because what they give us is a West Coast-wide perspective, a big geographic scope, and a strong interest in improving fish habitat. Fish habitat partnerships are kind of a big deal, which I didn't even know before I was part of one. So I recommend going to their website. There's also a flyer about PMEP up here on the front table. So the goal of this mapping effort is to create a spatial framework to support their fish assessment work, to better understand the conditions and prospects for fish on the West Coast. And we need to map our estuaries because we need to understand condition and impacts, and we need to help people identify and prioritize opportunities for restoration and conservation. It's probably obvious if you work with maps at all in the restoration world. And our general approach is we wanted to make sure we mapped the full spatial extent of the estuaries, everything from ocean up to head of tide, all of the freshwater tidal zone as well as the brackish. And we needed, of course, to even more closely define what a tidal wetland is. I mentioned it's inundated by the tides, but how often, of course, is the question. And the definition that we used, which is actually a pretty common one nationwide in the regulatory world and in the functional assessment world, that definition is once a year. If a wetland is inundated due to tidal forces once a year, it qualifies as a tidal wetland. So some areas you might not have thought of as tidal wetlands, because the tides push up into them in the winter, those are tidal wetlands. Even if it's just only due to high river levels, as long as it fluctuates with the tides, it's a tidal wetland. So it's a broader boundary than some people have used, but it is nationally consistent. We also wanted to make sure that we didn't only map current tidal wetlands, but we also encompassed those historical tidal wetlands that used to be but aren't anymore because of dikes and so forth. And that, when we refer to historical, for those of you in the geology world, we're not going back very far, only just before European settlement. So there were some maps out there when we started. I used them for many years. The National Wetland Inventory is one. But, and for instance, the Coastal Change Analysis Program has land cover mapping. Those maps don't have the same purposes as we had. They, for our purposes, they have some pretty big data gaps and inaccuracies. I'd been doing field work for 15 years in our estuaries and was so frustrated by the mapping that existed that the field work had clearly demonstrated we needed better maps. I found in the studies I did for specific individual estuaries on the Oregon coast that up to half of the tidal wetlands that were clearly identifiable in the field were missing from our maps. So we needed to make it better. That problem was greatest in the middle and upper estuaries. And at the same time, in the late 2000s, we began gathering sort of a critical mass of data that would support this mapping. And that included things like LIDAR and a whole lot of field monitoring information that we'd gathered over the past decade. So it was looking good to try to take a step forward here. So in order to map the full extent of the ocean, of the tides, we need to know the downslope boundary and the upslope boundary for these habitats. And the downslope boundary for the estuary could be defined by water depth, for instance. For vegetated tidal wetlands, you can pretty clearly see in an aerial photo the edge of the vegetation where it grade turns suddenly into mudflat, or maybe not quite so suddenly, but in any case, it's pretty easily visible on an aerial photo. So that's been mapped pretty well in the past. The upslope boundary has not been mapped well in the past. It's much more challenging, and it really depends on this definition of inundation due to tidal forces once a year. So we need to figure out, we needed to, when we started this, what is the actual elevation that defines that upper boundary of inundation? And then on the landscape, on the map, we need to map the areas that are below that elevation of annual high tide. Now in our area, NOAA, for our tide stations, NOAA publishes no datums in between mean high water and the highest measured tide. That's a pretty big gap. The highest measured tide only comes once every 19 years, so it's not a good boundary for us, even though I used it up until we had a better one, but we needed something better. The annual inundation elevation falls in between those two. Ultimately, it really is a modeling exercise, and something like a hydrodynamic model can get at this, but those are expensive, and even to run them for one estuary costs a lot of money, and we're not going to be able to do that for the whole Oregon coast, let alone the whole West Coast. So we had to come up with something simpler for this purpose. And in 2012, Andy Lanier at the Department of Land Conservation and Development and his colleagues submitted a grant to NOAA for an estuary project of special merit, and Cinnamon was involved in this project. And the idea was to modernize our coastal habitat maps for the coastal management program. So this was a really fantastic project, and I'm so grateful to Andy for starting it up, and to Tanya and Randy and Laura and Cinnamon for filling in the data that allowed us to do the maps for Oregon. And this is actually thanks to Patrick Clinton at EPA. We had been using highest measured tide for our elevational mapping prior to Pat's introducing me to NOAA's extreme water level models online. And these are NOAA's extreme water level analysis. You can find it online on Tides and Currents website. And what they do is they give you probabilities for water reaching a certain elevation on an annual basis. So they call that the annual exceedance probability. And on the graph here you can see elevation in meters above mean high water, y-axis, and then the x-axis is the decade. And as you can see, well, water levels are gradually rising, we knew that. And then you can see these colored lines which represent these probabilities. So the blue line represents almost certainty that water will get above that elevation once in a year, at least once. And NOAA says, well, it may get there more than once. So the next line that you'd look at would be 50% probability, which is a 1 in 2 chance that water will exceed that elevation in a given year. So we needed to look at these datums because they look like they might work better for our purposes of mapping these tidal wetlands. But we needed to figure out which of these elevations might work for us. So the first thing we had to do was turn them into a different elevation datum. If any of you have worked with elevation datums, you know there's tidal datums, and then there's geodetic or orthometric datums. LIDAR is the way we map elevations, and it's on a orthometric datum called NAVD88. So we translated these numbers on this chart. It's called a stick chart, and it shows the elevations of these different exceedance probabilities relative to mean sea level, but we needed to know what they were relative to the LIDAR. So we turned them into elevations on the right side there. In the green and blue boxes you can see on the NAVD88 datum, 50% exceedance at South Beach is 3.12 meters, or 10.2 feet. You have a quick question?
I do. I'm just curious why you chose that datum.
I'll tell you in a moment.
Okay.
We're just about to get there. So those are the elevations that we started to look at as possible cutoffs for our mapping. Let me show you exactly how we did that. We needed to look at in the field at what we know is a tidal wetland and figure out where it falls in on this range of elevations. So this is one site of several that we used for beginning to answer that question. Down in the Coquille, near Bandon, which is an amazing place, we have another amazing place called Nyleston, which is a tidal marsh restoration site. And we were monitoring that site to see how the restoration was going. Along with the restoration site is a reference site that had not been diked ever. And we put a bunch of groundwater wells out there to look at what's happening with groundwater, which is not something very many people have studied, but it's really neat. And the green dots represent those groundwater wells. Now, when the surface of that wetland is inundated, each of those groundwater wells acts as a local tide gauge. So we can determine whether these areas are tidally flooding or not. And we had watched those gauges, and we knew that all of them were tidally inundated, except maybe there was one back way up in the forest on the Nyleston side. We didn't know when we started the project which of these really were tidal wetlands and which weren't. But we found in the course of monitoring the surface water at these locations that these ones in the reference site, you can see 4 green dots, sorry, they're kind of small. All of those are definitely tidal wetlands. So the next question is, when we look at the LiDAR, what elevation does this match? So which exceedance contour matches? So now I'm showing you LiDAR on the left side, those colors, it's sort of a rainbow of colors, represents elevations from 2.5 to 14 feet. And 99% exceedance, you recall, was 8.6 feet. Well, that was not what it was at South Beach, but that's what it is here at Bandon. 50% exceedance is 9.6 feet. So where are T3 and T5? They're the higher ones of these 5 stations. Where do they fall in there? On this map, I've made the 99% exceedance interval 8.6 feet. I've turned those pixels black so you can look at that kind of like a contour line. And you can see that that black contour line falls below our 2 known tidal wetlands. T3GW and T5GW are both tidal wetlands. All the others are as well. T1, T4, T2, those are all tidal wetlands. Everything here is tidal. It has a green dot on it. So that black line was not going to work for us. That was too low on the landscape. It wouldn't work as a boundary. It would exclude known tidal wetlands. So the next higher up datum was 50% exceedance, and that line worked much better. That actually encompassed all our known tidal wetlands. And this isn't the only place we looked at. We looked at dozens of places where we've worked in the field to make sure that this boundary was a functional one. And it turns out it is. It worked quite well. So that was exciting. We had a pretty reasonable test of using this 50% exceedance contour as our boundary for the extent of tidal influence. So then we needed to extrapolate that datum or interpolate between stations to make a datum for each of our estuaries that we could use for the boundary, because high tide varies from estuary to estuary. The elevation of it varies. And this graph just shows latitude from 41 to 47 degrees, the whole state of Oregon, from Crescent City in California up to Choke Point in Washington, and the elevations of 50% exceedance at each NOAA station, the red dots, and then interpolated between for the black dots. So, so really the conclusion there is we have rising elevation for 50% exceedance. The tidal datums tend to get higher as you move up the coast, and I probably need a geologist to tell me exactly why that is, but they do. And so this is good. For Oregon, we could move forward, and we had a lot of expert review of our mapping and so forth, so I haven't told you a bunch of that, but I want to move on to the West Coast now. This is a graph from the whole West Coast showing how we ground truthed 50% exceedance for our larger mapping project that we did through PMEP. So on this figure on the left, you can see elevation in meters. It's on that same NAVD 88 datum. And you can also see an orange line. That's the elevation of the 50% exceedance datum. At each of these locations, the x-axis is south to north. South is on the left. That's the Tijuana estuary, right next to the California border on the left edge of the x-axis. And way over on the right edge is the Nooksack, as far north as you can get until you get into Canada. And so then we needed to find tidal wetlands in a number of estuaries on the West Coast and find out what their elevations were and make sure that they fell below 50% exceedance, but not too far below. So is 50% exceedance a reasonable boundary for the West Coast? And it turns out that it is. There's some variation, but almost all the tidal wetlands fell below, but not too far below 50% exceedance. So this was looking reasonable, and we felt we could then move forward with mapping for the whole west coast. And oh, by the way, these different shapes of dots represent the different tidal wetlands that were actually measured, that their elevations were checked, and it was known by field personnel that they were tidal wetlands. This one figure would make a great publication if we, had time for another year worth of prep. Anyway, I love this figure. So that's an ugly map of interpolating 50% exceedance between NOAA tide stations for the whole west coast. And this is a little bit more beautiful figure. The orange line on the top is kind of like that set of points I showed you for Oregon, showing how 50% exceedance elevations change from south on the left to north on the right. So this shows where our boundary fell for tidal wetlands elevation-wise across the whole west coast. And the bottom half of this page here shows the coast turned on its side. So it's a little odd looking, but that was how you could fit it on the slide. So, the Columbia River is different. I'm sure some of you have worked up there and know that the hydrology in the Columbia River is quite different from the outer coast. So we needed to bring in a different set of datums. Luckily, there was an Army Corps model available, and it had been turned into a spatial data set of areas below the 2-year flood elevation. PC Trask was kind enough to pass that spatial data layer along to us, and we plugged it into the West Coast mapping. So I've been talking a lot about mapping the estuary, and there's a few details that I don't want to go into in depth. One is using VDatum. It's a tool to make sure your tidal datums are correct as you move up estuary. And we did that, both the Oregon project and the West Coast project. And so to just show you an example of how this works on the ground and why it matters, here's the Tillamook Bay estuary. And on the upper left, you can see the bay itself with the exit to the ocean. And then you see this big agricultural floodplain, 5 rivers, actually I guess it's 3 on the major part of the floodplain at the south. They all flow into the bay. There's a lot of flat ground here, and in the past the mapping of the estuary has not been good at distinguishing what's tidal and what's not tidal. Most of those areas are diked, so you can't just go out and look at water levels. But we want to know where the historical estuary used to be, so we're looking at elevation of the landscape. So I'm going to go down to this one spot. And if I were to give you this and say, please tell me where the tidal wetlands used to be, it's very difficult to answer that question. It's a bunch of flat ground. It's diked agricultural fields. But to understand A, vulnerability of these lands to future tidal flooding, and B, potential restoration if we were to find landowners interested in that, we really need to know where the wetlands used to be, the tidal wetlands. So this is how we did that. We mapped that 50% exceedance elevation as a contour line on the landscape. And so everything below that black line is formerly part of the estuary, and everything above it isn't, using this model. And it's been a very functional model and a good way to distinguish these different parts of the landscape. The result then, when you make it into a map, looks like that blue blob. So that blue blob is the current and historical estuary extent for this part of the Tillamook Bay estuary. Pretty amazing data when you run it out for the whole West Coast. 450 or more estuaries, many of which are very small, but that's the number of estuaries where we've done this mapping now. So you can get that data online at the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership's website. And I've circled in orange the specific layer that I'm talking about, the current and historical estuary extent. There's a lot of other data at PMEP too, and I'll go into that next. But first I want to show you a couple more maps of estuary extent. So it was hard to see on the full West Coast where the estuaries were, but by zooming in I can show you these red areas are the current and historical extent of these different estuaries. So you're looking here at the Columbia River on the lower left, and then Puget Sound on the upper left, up into Vancouver Island even. The red areas are those estuaries, their historical extent. You can see a big red blob at the top. That's the major river deltas of the Salish Sea, like the Skagit and the Snohomish and Stillaguamish and so forth. Then on the lower left, you can see Grace Harbor, Willapa Bay, and the Columbia River. And so these are some of our biggest estuary features in the Northwest. Here's Oregon. There's the Columbia at the top and all our scattered small estuaries on our Oregon coast. We have a unique layout here. It's an interesting one because of all our coastal headlands. We have many smaller estuaries, probably very important from a genetic diversity point of view for salmon. Every part of the West Coast is different. Honestly, you saw how interesting the Puget Sound and outer coast of Washington were. Oregon is very distinct from those, and California is very distinct from either of those. So here's the whole California coast. It's huge, of course, and all you can really see is the San Francisco Bay estuary and its Sacramento and San Joaquin River delta that feeds into San Francisco Bay, and then you can see a tiny red spot on the upper left that's Humboldt Bay. And there's another 200 estuaries in California that you can't even see. So it's a big place. So in order to demonstrate the significance and magnitude of this change in mapping, I want to show you going back to the Coquille River estuary on the South Oregon coast. This is the Coquille River, that yellow line running out to the ocean at the left. And the orange shows, sort of yellowish orange, shows what the National Wetland Inventory maps as tidal wetlands. There's not very many. It's a small area. The river itself is tidal, so it's mapped as a tidal riverine feature. Now I'm going to show you in blue what our mapping looks like. So this is a pretty big change in how we view the estuary of the Coquille River. I think people knew on one level that a lot of these diked farmlands had been part of the estuary, but it wasn't really that common knowledge either. So I really think this builds our understanding substantially. Similarly, for San Francisco Bay, I'm just going to zoom in to the north part. This is a terrible grayscale image. Let's skip over it. The north part of San Francisco Bay here, you're seeing some big blobs. Those yellow blobs are San Pablo Bay and Sassoon Bay and Grizzly Bay. This is the National Wetland Inventory mapping of estuaries. And up until we did our study, a lot of resources that talked about the San Francisco Bay estuary and its condition only looked at these yellow areas. But the blue is what we should be talking about, because this is the historical extent of the estuary. So it's, again, that's a pretty big change from the yellow to the blue. So we've done quite a bit of validation and review of these products, and I don't need to bother you with all the details on that, but we did a bunch of ground truthing. We had a lot of expert reviews. We had a web map where people could put in their comments. And then we also did some comparisons to other studies. So you can guess we're not the first people to look at San Francisco Bay. I mean, good heavens, there's hundreds of scientists studying the estuary down there. So who are we to come along and say, we would like to map your estuary? Instead, what we did was create consistent data for the whole West Coast so we can compare apples to apples. And then we also compared our work to their much more detailed, locally informed mapping in order to make sure it worked. So San Francisco Estuary Institute did these lovely historical ecology studies, and I really recommend you just Google that term and look those up. They're wonderful. And up in Puget Sound, too, they've done some nice work on historical wetlands, and we compared our maps to theirs. We found there was a really good match. I'll show you some details. For California, we matched the historical ecology data very closely. In Washington, we matched Pisnerp's work very closely. In Oregon, we had these two independent efforts. Oregon had done the work in 2014, completed it in 2014. PMEP came along and redid the work for the whole West Coast so we could compare those two and make sure they aligned. And they should, because they're using the same methods, but it was a nice way to validate the work and make sure nothing went radically wrong. So looking at San Francisco Bay again, because it's pretty big, here's our blue mapping for the north part of the bay, San Pablo Bay, Sassoon and Grizzly Bay, and then that's the delta on the right of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. So zooming into Sassoon and Grizzly Bay, this pink area shows tidal wetlands from their historical ecology study that they did at SFEI. And this blue laid on top of the pink is our mapping, and I was really amazed how closely they lined up, especially considering this isn't steep hill slopes coming down to the flat valley. There's some gradual topography here. So to see these boundaries line up so perfectly was quite amazing. SFEI's study was not done using elevational data. They did it using a lot of historical papers and maps and studies and data and narratives. And so anyway, it was very satisfying to know that our work ended up showing the same results. And Snohomish up in Puget Sound did a historical wetland study, and the pink shows their data. Here's our blue data on top of the pink. You can see that it matches quite closely as well. There's a little more in their historical wetlands on the sort of the main stem, but we captured another low area that they missed. So there's some trade-offs spatially, but basically it's matching up very well within about 100 to 400 meters, which I never expected for a full West Coast mapping effort. So as I mentioned, PMEP and OCMP did this mapping independently, and we compared them for Oregon as well. They matched up nicely. I won't show you any details. They map almost exactly. PMEP's final map products actually used our Oregon spatial data because they didn't want to overstep what Oregon had done. So PMEP's products will match exactly if you go to the OCMP website. It's the same. So these new maps for the West Coast, they really improve our understanding of our estuaries. And they give us consistency as we try to analyze estuary condition across the West Coast. And they've been pretty well reviewed. They match up with other data sources, so we think they make a good base layer for all kinds of analyses. And so I hope I've answered these or demonstrated these first 2 points that I wanted to bring to you, and then we can move into the loss assessment. And in a way, I feel bad about spending so much time on the nuts and bolts of how we did the mapping, but it's important. And I think people have done loss assessments before, but not with this solid kind of base data. So it's very important. So now, up to our loss assessment. What we did with PMEP is what I would call an indirect assessment of tidal wetland losses. And I'm going to grab a drink of water here, so hang on. I think somehow this image with all the water in it makes me thirsty. And this work was done by, the GIS work was done by Brett Holycross and Van Hare at the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. I developed the method and worked with them on the what ends up being more complex than it should have been on the implementation. It's a simple approach. It's an indirect approach, and I'll explain that. So as I mentioned, our estuary extent mapped by PMEP, it maps the historical and current tidal wetlands, but one of the first questions people ask us is, yeah, but a lot of those aren't tidal wetlands, right? And of course that's true. Many of them are diked off, 85% in fact. So we needed to know what areas those are, and this is where we got that number from through this analysis. We need those data on losses in order to figure out what has our impact been. That's really important for understanding the current condition of all kinds of fish and wildlife and so forth. And we need them to assess restoration potential and set priorities for where restoration could occur. Now, these are the 3 wetland types that we can get at with this analysis, only these 3. These are the higher intertidals. We don't try to get at seagrasses. The method we use wouldn't work for those. But tidal marsh, low marsh, high marsh, tidal swamp, either shrub or forested, we can figure out what the losses have been. Luckily, these 3 wetland classes also are the target for most restoration activities, so they're an appropriate area to study. So here's how we did the analysis. So we took the National Wetland Inventory, which I showed you some maps before, and they were only a small part of the historical estuary, but what they are is what is obviously currently tidal. And the NWI has been pretty good at identifying the areas that are pretty clearly tidal, like tidal marsh. That's what we considered, those wetlands we considered to be retained. Everything within our historical estuary boundary, done elevationally, we considered to be lost if it wasn't listed as tidal in the NWI. And there's some parallels to this approach, but it was one that we could implement for the whole West Coast and get a number that's going to be very useful. We didn't try to analyze non-vegetated areas, with the exception of things like former tidal marsh that had been diked off and had lost its vegetation. I'm going to tell you about some of the limitations of this assessment. It is an indirect assessment because a direct assessment of loss would have maps of disconnected areas. Like we'd have a map showing us this area is diked, this area is diked, so we know those are lost. We didn't have that data for the whole West Coast, so we had to use this other approach. We do have that data for Oregon, and one of the papers I put up on the front here, one of the handouts, is for a study using that direct assessment method to get at Oregon's tidal wetland losses in a more refined and accurate way. So an indirect assessment was a reasonable way to approach the whole West Coast and get some numbers out there for people to use. This is a table showing the NWI's classification system and whether things are vegetated or non-vegetated, whether they're non-tidal or tidal in NWI, whether they're marine, riverine, estuarine, palustrine. It's a complex classification system, but what you can see is there's only 4 blocks or cells here that are considered retained, and those are the ones that were tidal in the NWI. Clearly tidal, not diked, not drained, not farmed, etc. If you want all the details, then check out our PLOS One publication. So what we found, and I need to tell you some of the initial results that explain sort of why we took the focus we then did. The method really works best in larger estuaries where you've had substantial human alterations like diking. Some kinds of loss can't be detected using this method. If there's more subtle losses, they're hard to detect. For small estuaries, there's some scale problems. We had really detailed LiDAR mapping, and we had a less detailed NWI, and sometimes they just don't line up very well, and that can be misleading. So we limited the analysis to the 55 larger estuaries, over 100 hectares of historical tidal wetland area. Even though that's only 55 out of 450 estuaries on the west coast, it's 97% of the total historical tidal wetland area, so it's still telling us what we need to know for the big picture. So we also found that this method underestimates loss in developed areas like Los Angeles Harbor. Oh my gosh, all the former tidal wetlands there have been completely filled and elevated 20 feet and turned into giant shipping docks. So, our method couldn't get at those because we used elevation to define the historical tidal wetland, and their elevation's really different now than it used to be. So we can't get at all kinds of loss, but we can get at a lot of kinds of loss. We also found this method can overestimate loss where estuaries have had a lot of restoration work done. That would be, for instance, when we started, the Nisqually had several hundred acres restored, but they were shown in the NWI as non-tidal because the NWI was from 10 years ago and the restoration was only done recently. So PMEP got on that, and actually this year they've mapped restored areas and done a nice job with that. That data will be up on their website. It isn't quite yet. For some more technical reasons, we couldn't use this in lagoonal estuaries, which predominate in Southern California, so we didn't try to get at those. I'll get to a couple other limitations in a minute, but this is the same figure I showed you earlier with the numbers by region that the final analysis showed. That Central California number of 91.7 is the largest, and that's mainly driven by the San Francisco Bay estuary, all those delta lands that are farm fields now. It's a very high magnitude of loss. This is by the type of wetland, the percent loss by type of wetland. Riverine estuaries, on average, had less loss. Major river deltas like the Sacramento-San Joaquin, San Francisco Bay area, and up in the Skagit, they had the highest losses, probably just because they're attractive agricultural lands. By ecoregion, again, Central California was the highest. You saw these numbers on the map earlier. Southern California Bight shows only 59% loss, but I'm sure that's low because so many of those are heavily urbanized, and so a lot of their wetlands have been filled, and we can't get at that with this analysis, so that's one of the caveats to this study. So this is where the data live online, and I definitely recommend, if you have any interest in this, downloading them and exploring these data. These are a few graphics showing examples. So I mentioned the Skagit up in Puget Sound. The Skagit River comes in from the upper right corner of this map and flows into Skagit Bay. And the orange areas are diked tidal wetlands. The blue represent the non-diked. So there's a bar chart here, and you can see some figures in tiny, tiny lettering. Sorry, you probably can't read them. 82.6% loss for the Skagit. So it's probably sort of along the lines of the average for the West Coast. The Siuslaw here in Oregon, one that I've worked a lot in, had about a 55% loss. Trying to think if there's been any restoration since. Yes, there has been a little restoration since this was done. So it's a little lower than that. Humboldt Bay had a 86% loss. San Francisco, well, this is actually the upriver Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta area. This is the highest, 97% loss. So there's almost nothing left of the tidal wetlands that used to occupy that area, which were mostly tule. A lot of them were tule marshes. So the limitations of this loss analysis, I've mentioned a couple of them. The NWI scale is an issue. It represents a point in time, so if the NWI was outdated, well, then we don't have very accurate information. One of the things that can happen is in Oregon and in the Northwest in general, we have these beautiful forested tidal wetlands. Most of them aren't mapped as tidal wetlands in the NWI. They're mapped as palustrine wetlands. There's no tidal water regime modifier in the NWI coding. And that's, I don't blame the NWI for that. These things take time to figure out. We've only been learning about the forested tidal wetlands recently. But that can overestimate loss because those areas are going to end up being shown as lost because they're non-tidal in the NWI. So again, recommend going to my more recent study that uses direct data instead of an indirect assessment, and then we solved that problem. So here's Tillamook Bay showing an example of this. If you know Tillamook, you know Hocourton Slough right near downtown. It's a really beautiful forested wetland that's a tidal swamp. It's one of the few and largest remnants left on the Oregon coast. Unfortunately, the NWI codes it as non-tidal, so it shows up as lost in our assessment. Not correct. I'm probably more bothered by these flaws in our study, but they don't affect the overall understanding of loss, but I want to fix them. The Southern Flow Corridor is a big restoration we just did a couple years ago in Tillamook. It's shown as non-tidal here because it hadn't been restored when the NWI was created. I fixed that in my recent analysis, and it'll get updated for PMEP too. This doesn't happen very often. It's possible that the NWI could show an area as being tidal that actually is disconnected, but we have a pretty good Coastal Management Zone Act, and there's not too much of that happening anymore where we're getting filled tidal wetlands. There's still some areas that are still getting filled or disconnected. That could result in an underestimate of loss if there's change since the NWI. There's also the limitations of our estuary extent data. I already mentioned the filled and developed areas. I won't go into that. There could be some cases where the estuary extent line, that 50% exceedance boundary, could be too far up the landscape. And here's one example of that. Okay, so back to the San Francisco Bay Area, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta is shown in the upper left. And then if you look at the lower right-hand red box in the upper left-hand panel, that's, this is really, I'm sorry, I'm trying to speak so the people who are online know what I'm talking about. In the lower left panel of this slide, see the orange area? That represents a place where our PMEP mapping goes farther than the historical mapping that SFEI did. And it's pretty substantial in this case, up to 1 kilometer in some areas. And why would that be? We think it's primarily subsidence due to agricultural activities on what had been highly organic marsh soils. They sank like a stone. You may know that in the San Francisco Bay Delta, which is what we're looking at here, there's been 3 meters or more of subsidence. So the land surface there is 10 feet lower than it was historically. And so that happened after diking and draining. So naturally, the historical extent might be a little closer to the ocean, and now that it's so subsided, our line runs a little farther up the landscape. Although that makes our map perhaps not as comparable to the SFEI's work, it's still very legitimate data for organizations to have because that is within tide range now. So anyway, and then there's some filled areas on the lower right tank that show sort of the opposite, where we have filled lands that we didn't map in our mapping. But overall, these are small differences, and the overall comparisons came out well. We actually did spatial, we did spatial comparison of our loss assessment to loss assessments that other organizations had done. They came out really close. This is the lower Columbia River. Our data with orange being lost wetlands, blue being retained wetlands. And here is the Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnerships work. They did a loss assessment too. Their losses are in orange, dark orange, and their retained wetlands are in dark blue. So just flipping back and forth, you can see they match up very closely. 93.6% agreement spatially, so that's a very high level of agreement. So it basically just corroborates the work that we did here and gives us confidence that it's real. This is the Nehalem River, and I'm going to compare our PMEP loss assessment to the Oregon Coastal Management Program's work. They mapped diked areas. It comes out fairly similar. So that was a little lower percent, 82.2. Mainly the difference there is that when we did those diked areas for Oregon, we did a lot of on-the-ground work. We had a lot of field data to support the mapping, so I think our OCMP mapping is pretty accurate. And again, for the San Francisco Bay area, here's our assessment. And there's the San Francisco Estuary Institute's tidal wetland loss data, and they're very, very similar. 95.6% agreement. So overall, our agreement's really good, and that makes this loss assessment a solid product for the whole West Coast. We covered 97% of historical tidal wetlands. We saw strikingly high levels of loss, and this gives us important information for understanding what our impact has been on the West Coast and to move forward with conservation planning. We really have a bunch of next steps that we want to do now. The first was to start looking at loss by habitat class. So we've talked about tidal wetlands as a whole, but I'm really interested in, did we lose more of our forested tidal wetlands? What about shrub tidal wetlands? What about marsh? We can't yet do that for the whole West Coast because the data aren't there, but I did just finish that for the Oregon coast, and that report will be out soon, and the teaser's up on the front here. And then we need to map restored areas, and PMEP has done that now, not in a complete fashion. Not every restored area is mapped, but it's a good start. It gets at the restored areas that weren't in the NWI yet. And that data will be up on PMEP's website. So you're sort of seeing the things that are just about to come out here. And we want to do a better job mapping disconnected areas so we can do a direct assessment of losses for the whole West Coast. Those data don't exist yet. We also need to obviously be looking at climate change and sea level rise. We did a project for the Oregon coast that you may be familiar with. We called it our landward migration zone, looking at where tidal wetlands might be in the future up the landscape. And we used this elevation-based mapping as our baseline for that work. And it's really the only logical starting point for doing that kind of sea level rise work. So we'd like to see that for other parts of the West Coast, and it has been done for some of them. I'm sure the San Francisco Bay Area has lots of studies of this. Recommended uses for these data. Well, those previous things that I mentioned, using this data as a base layer for understanding climate change impacts, that's a very important next step. Really, I guess I've gone across a lot of this, comparing wetland losses at broad scales, estuaries, regions, land types. The data really aren't intended to be used for site-specific assessment. It's a nice place to look to start, but you can't really get a delineation of wetlands on your land from looking at this mapping. It's not intended for that. So we try to point that out. We do need to refine the data and even make it better in the future, but it's a good start. We're actually talking with people about getting these methods going nationally now to get more consistent data across the whole country. So that's the final major point, and I just wanted to show you the online sources. There's the URLs. If you go to PMEP's webpage, you see a couple applications here that are web maps. You could go explore those, and if you scroll down, you'll see the individual data sets here that you can download. And besides the two that I've talked about, there's others, which I'll mention in a minute, but these are some fun tools. Data Basin and the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Co-op and PMEP work together to create this West Coast Estuaries Explorer, and it's a real interesting interactive page where you can compare estuaries and habitats. This is our +1 paper that we just came out with, which if you like this topic, I'd encourage you to read. It's a lot of good information. And if you want to know more about Oregon coast specifically, go to the OCMP's data on the Coastal Atlas. And you can look at the CMEX estuary classification here, which is our mapping I just showed you. You could look at the aquatic setting, that's the current and historical extent of the estuary. You can look at the biotic component, that's whether it's a marsh or forested or shrub, and also quite a few other categories like algae beds and so forth. You can also look at geoform and substrate, which are other components of CMEX. Those of you who helped us with creating the CMEX data, thank you. We had a lot of help from people in this room on that. So those are two red circles that I didn't mention, the biotic habitat, and then on the lower left, the eelgrass, which is another mapping effort PMEP completed recently, is better mapping of eelgrass for the whole West Coast, which is a wonderful product too. So check, check, check. I think I got through all the topics and I'm only 5 minutes over time, so I hope we can have a discussion now because I'm really interested in your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Did you consider the FEMA flood return removal modeling?
Yes. Yes, we basically felt that in order to be specific to tidal inundation and focus our work on the estuary itself, that we needed to pursue this percent exceedance as our source. And I think the floodplain mapping often comes close, but we didn't end up using that as a source. I did have some folks mention it to me, and we did look at it, but that was not the direction we ended up going. Other questions? Yeah.
It's hard to imagine with all that flooding that you won't have a net percent loss of low salinity areas relative to the high salinity areas. So the ocean comes in, we're going to have lagoons.
Yeah, I think the salt stress is going to increase for sure on a lot of plant communities. And that could apply upstream as you get into the areas that were formerly or are currently forested or were once forested but are not, but are currently diked. If we want to restore forested tidal wetlands, we're going to have to think about where salt will be in the future, because they can't take too much salt. They can take some. One of the interesting discoveries has been tidal swamps, that's the forested and shrub tidal wetlands in Oregon, are brackish most of the time. They're not, I mean, most of them are brackish during the dry season. People used to think they only formed in freshwater tidal areas, but that's not the case. Sitka spruce can take mesohalian salinities in the summer. So they can still hang on as salt increases and moves up the system, but only to a limited extent. So yeah, there's going to be definitely changes. Yeah. Ted?
So have you ideas on how to take a step beyond this to look at what types of habitats might have been present in those lost areas?
There's a paper right here. This is exciting to me. This is the study I've just finished, and I'm writing up the final report right now. It was funded by NOAA through PMEP. Thanks to them again. And yeah, I evaluated losses for marsh, shrub, and forested separately here. So losses were much higher for forested, as you can imagine. 95% net loss of tidal marsh. When you count all the newly accreted marsh, net loss is only 10%. But of the historical marsh, 59% of the historical marsh was lost. But new marsh has formed, which offset a fair bit of that. There's been virtually no new forested wetlands formed. They take longer to form, I think. And it won't happen out on the edge of the bay where accretion is happening. So yeah, please, you're already on my list to send this report to, but please take this because it's got the executive summary in it. The numbers aren't going to change.
So are those now included as layers on top of these maps of the potential historical extent, or are these estimates?
They are maps. They aren't on PMEP's website yet. I'll be talking with them about where we can get this stuff up on an interactive map. So yeah, it's all spatially explicit data, and it can be used to locate potential swamp restoration areas. There's a bunch of caveats around that, mainly subsidence. And they can be used to locate current remaining tidal swamps, which are often not well protected because people don't even know that they're tidal wetlands, so they aren't commonly present in comprehensive plans of any local coastal communities.
I think also if you're thinking about prioritizing and recommending restoration, if you knew what was successful or grew there before loss, that might be a good one to try to shoot for.
Yeah. Yeah, with the caveat that often the land surface is much lower now if that was a diked area, so if it subsided a foot or two, it may not easily support tidal forests anymore. But some of them still can, and some parts of them can, and we can try to engineer the site to help support that and build the land surface back up. And one of the things I recommend, there's a whole appendix in here about that topic of restoring tidal swamps. One of the recommendations is to find some remnant of tidal swamp near your proposed restoration site and measure, the ground surface elevation and measure the inundation regime and the salinities and see if it looks like conditions really are going to be appropriate. I just bring you this because you're going to want it. You're welcome. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, well, one thing you mentioned about that paper that's, I think, also super interesting, maybe not to spoil it for people, but you mentioned the
the accretion of new wetland and how the loss is actually, if you've gone to pre-European, it might be like a 50% loss, but when you actually consider it accreted, it only adds up to like 10% loss. So a huge amount of new accreted tidal vegetated wetland, which I think a lot of us didn't even maybe think about.
I know. It's
and
amazing.
Not only that, there's also, it also makes me wonder, what was the habitat before it was accreted? So is this a loss of unvegetated mudflat habitat because it accreted into vegetated?
That's such a good point. Yeah, what might look to be a mitigating factor in like, oh, things aren't so bad as we thought. Well, we have lost a lot of mudflat habitat when that turned into vegetated tidal marsh. So there's a plus and a minus to it. But having numbers and maps of where exactly that has occurred on the coast is really going to be a useful tool for people. And one neat thing about that is, as we think about our future with sea level rise, Oregon is in a better place than a lot of parts of the country because we have a lot of available sediments and steep coastal watersheds. And right now, the majority of our sediments are exported to the near shore. But as sea level rises, more of them can be trapped. If we pull out the dikes that are in their way where we can, we have a better chance of building our surfaces up and maintaining versus sea level rise. Any other questions? Thank you. Yeah.
Did you have trouble with the boundary layers?
What boundary layers are you?
Between tidal and non-tidal.
Oh, well, we created the boundary using elevation data, as you know, so we just drew a contour. And so we didn't import any other layer for that purpose. We sort of generated our own boundary.
Did you really define things that were non-tidal or historically tidal by
just
topographic line between them? See if it was part of the analysis.
Yeah, our topo line basically just defines everything that should be inundated by the tides if there were no barriers in place. So all of the lands that are behind dikes are still low. They're still within tide range. Usually they're quite a bit lower than they were historically. And there might be, there are some that have been filled. People have placed material in there, and some of them are filled so high they're no longer within tide range, and we missed those. So that's, that's a problem with the method. Tacoma, we lost all the estuary in Tacoma because of that, and LA Harbor. But in general, we were able to capture the historical tidal wetlands just by using an elevational boundary. So yeah, thank you. Good question. Any others?
And when you say historical, you have taken into account the change over time since pre-European settlement in whatever year you're choosing there, roughly.
It's a good point.
That's, we're talking about roughly, what, 400 years?
It's quite a few years.
Right?
And
so that certainly encompasses, some sea level rise during that period. So I'm asking, when you say historical, you've subtracted that sea level rise. Correct?
Well, there's a lot of error in each component of an analysis like this, and there's error in the LiDAR. Yeah, exactly, right. There's error in the LiDAR. There's error due to land uplift rates, differential and land uplift rates on the coast. Chunk change is a good way to describe it. I mean, I would love it if we could do that level of analysis where we could account for past sea level rise, past land motion, tectonic motion. We really can't and do this in an efficient way, so we decided to go ahead with the analysis, flawed as it is, but it seems to work pretty well. I mean, the comparison for the Snohomish really shows that because, they've undergone land movement just as the Oregon coast has. San Francisco Bay maybe a little bit less so, but a very close matchup of the data they laboriously extracted from land survey records from the 1800s matched our line almost exactly. So I think all those factors have maybe they're...
No, I was very impressed by the matching.
I know, I was honestly super surprised to see that. I thought this would be a useful but perhaps not very accurate mapping effort. It turned out to be much better than that. So that's always kind of nice when it turns out that way.
Great presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
I got one.
Yes.
I got one about LiDAR. Is it pretty consistent along the west coast, or do you find areas that need more data, like more remote sensing data?
Well, the LiDAR has been reasonably consistent in terms of its reported accuracy for the West Coast. I think the specifications that are issued by agencies organizing larger LiDAR acquisition efforts they talk to each other. So I think it's been, as far as I know, reasonably consistent. The errors for Oregon are the only ones I'm really familiar with, and they range around 10 to 15 centimeters vertical, which is okay. You know, it's good enough for our purposes. And NOAA has been gathering these data together in their tsunami layers. That's where they were downloaded from. I'm a little fuzzy on some of these details because I didn't do this part of the GIS. But I think it's been, it was a big effort to gather the LiDAR from multiple sources, but I think that, yeah.
Do you see any advantages using like drone imagery for certain areas?
Ground imagery as in aerial?
Or just using drones for...
Oh, drone imagery.
Or finer scale, like where you can't get underneath the tree canopy.
Yeah, drones are great for all kinds of site-specific project work. Yeah, I think that just by nature they're going to be best for smaller areas. But yeah, fantastic. I'm waiting for someone to build me the drone that can fly through the spruce swamp. I'm very anxious for that because I can't walk through them very easily. So, any more thoughts, questions? Thank you for coming.
If you'd like to join us for Science on Tap, I think it's February 18th.
Okay.
Is when Laura will be coming back and we'll be talking about her other project.
Tidal swamps.
Yay. All right, thank you everybody.
Yay. And I. Good. Good.
My headset started to fade because every time that I like hit it and it would
Oh.
stop working, I was like, oh no.
Oh.
Any questions?
Yeah, we're there.
Okay.